Hi, this is David Miller, and I'm here with an introductory overview of the Philip Pullman trilogy, His Dark Materials. The next time we'll go on to talk a little more about the first novel in the trilogy, The Golden Compass. The title of the trilogy comes from a passage in Milton's Paradise Lost. The passage from which Pullman borrows his title belongs to Milton's description of chaos. It mentions a possibility Milton never pursues, the idea that the Almighty Maker might create more worlds than the one Milton is about to describe. Well, the universe Pullman imagines does, in fact, contain many worlds, existing in parallel dimensions without coming into direct contact. In taking this passage from Milton as his point of departure, Pullman is doing several important things at once. He's marking the connection between his fiction and the traditional narrative of creation set forth in the book of Genesis and elaborated in Milton's great poem. At the same time, he's marking a point of departure. Where Milton sought to build on the biblical narrative with perfect fidelity, Pullman seeks to transform it. In this, he resembles Dickens, but Pullman's return to the scriptures is at once more explicit and more radical. So it is that the dark materials that for Milton belonged in chaos, a place without shape or order, full of stuff properly not yet created at all, become for Pullman what modern physics calls dark matter. And in yet a further twist, this dark matter turns out to be both conscious and alive. The line God speaks to Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis as a curse, "You are dust, and to dust you shall return," becomes in this version of the story a blessing, for dust signifies not lifeless matter as in the Bible, but the underlying source of all life and spirit in the universe, the source, as we will see in the third book of the trilogy, from which God himself has sprung. Pretty radical departure. Remember the typology of the Apple logo? That was my example of transvaluation, a process in which you take up the old symbols in such a way as to reverse their polarity. Pullman does this with the traditional ideas of matter and spirit. In his story about the cosmos, living, conscious matter, and not pure abstract spirit, is the immortal source of all things. The Golden Compass begins as Lyra's story, the tale of a young girl who discovers the truth about her own birth and the real identity of her parents. But by the time the trilogy has worked its way to a conclusion, Lyra's story will turn out to be the story of time and the universe themselves. That's Pullman's New Covenant. We get hints of this cosmic significance early in the first volume when certain characters refer to prophecies that identify Lyra with Eve from the Garden of Eden. Over the course of the trilogy, these hints are developed into a complete revision of modern science, European history, and the Christian religion. The resemblance to Charles Dickens is no accident. Dickens, remember, gets the idea of reinventing traditional belief partly from the Victorian critic Thomas Carlyle, but it's also a central theme of the Romantic movement in literature and politics beginning in the late 18th century. Pullman gets it from William Blake, who sought to transvalue both Milton and the Bible in much the way Pullman does. Blake's fascinating prose poem, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, is a quintessential document of Romanticism in the way it explicitly announces a new covenant meant to purge Christianity by returning to its pure origins. If you look at it this way, a great deal of literary history since the 16th century can be seen as an extension of the Protestant Reformation. We've seen all semester that writers like Shakespeare and Milton and Blake and Dickens are attempting a secular reformation of literature. Pullman places himself squarely in this tradition. The Golden Compass is connected to the materials we've read in this course in other ways as well. The next mini-lecture will be called The Daughter's Rebellion, because I want to emphasize how much Lyra has in common with Juliet, Elizabeth Bennet, and Tracy Lord, as well as with Eve. Here again, though, it's important to recognize that she takes up the narrative pattern we see in those stories in order to transform it into something new. This daughter will succeed in telling her own story. Indeed, she will insist on doing so with the kind of fully developed, extraordinary courage that we just glimpsed in Juliet. And that will make all the difference, for when the daughter finally succeeds in her rebellion against the deified father, when she finally learns to tell her own story on her own terms, the change is so drastic that no other story will ever be the same. The deified father himself will have to die if the rebellious daughter cannot be destroyed or made to submit. In the midst of this radical transformation of the traditional narrative patterns, I hope you'll take some pleasure in recognizing how Pullman is reinventing key elements of the tradition we've been studying. For example, Lyra is from the very beginning marked out for us as a storyteller. Her name echoes both lyre, the instrument used by the poets of Greek mythology, and liar, because she's very good at making things up and takes pleasure in doing so. But she is also a special kind of reader. The scenes of reading we've been spotting in Austen and Dickens and others reappear in Lyra's special gift for interpreting the symbol reader she gets from the master of Jordan College. This device is the title character of the first novel, the golden compass that guides its action. It is by learning to read the symbols that Lyra manages to gain control over her story, and as we learn in subsequent volumes of the trilogy, this is because the symbol reader enables Lyra to communicate with dust, which plays a role something like that of omniscient narrator in the universe Pullman has imagined. Pullman's trilogy begins in a parallel universe. That's why the places and the history we read about are both familiar and completely strange. Lyra's world is an alternative version of ours. An early reference to Pope John Calvin makes it clear that in this world the Reformation never happened. Accordingly, there is no separation of church and state. In fact, there isn't even a separation between science and religion, so what we would call scientific equipment is referred to in this world as philosophical apparatus, and it is housed in a chapel rather than a laboratory. What we call physics and astronomy go by the name of experimental theology. Pullman has also invented a whole new set of names for familiar things. Or rather, he's gone back into the history of language and discovered alternative names for them, as befits a parallel universe. These are often archaic forms of words we know. Tartar for Turk, for instance, or Muscovy for Russia. Electric becomes anbaric because, as Pullman explains, I looked up the word electric and I found that it came from the Greek word for amber. The Greeks knew that if they rubbed a piece of amber, they could create static electricity. Then I looked up the word amber and found it came from the Arabic word anbar. In a similar way, petroleum becomes naphtha and gin becomes juniper juice. This alternative universe has a strangely archaic feel to it, not only because the church has so much political and economic power, but also because women still have so little. There are no airplanes or space shuttles. Flight is achieved only with zeppelins and hot air balloons. And there seem to be no automobiles, although there are streetcars and a subway system in London, probably run on electricity. Yet for all the archaic feel of this world, a powerful scientific technology does seem to coexist with this essentially medieval political structure of church rule. And so we see references to atomcraft, which we know as nuclear physics, and as I mentioned earlier, we see Lyra learning to operate an alethiometer, a truth measure, as Farder Coram explains when she shows it to him. There are technological wonders in Lyra's seemingly archaic world that we have yet to achieve in our own. The protagonist of the Golden Compass is Lyra Belacqua, who is probably about 11 when the story begins. Around her, Pullman assembles a large and brilliantly varied cast. There are, of course, the scholars and servants of Jordan College in Oxford, where the story begins, although these characters fade quickly from view. There are Lyra's friends among the children, especially Roger, the special friend she will risk everything to rescue from the gobblers. Lyra's other special friend is her demon, Pantaleimon. One of the strangest features of her world is that every human being has an attendant spirit in animal form. The closest precedent I can think of is Jiminy Cricket, who plays the voice of Pinocchio's conscience in the Disney film. It's hard to say what exactly demons are. They're not conscience because Lyra appeals to her conscience in one of her arguments with Pantaleimon. They are intelligent beings in animal form, separate in body but not in spirit from their human companions. Also in Oxford, we are introduced to the Gyptians, gypsies in our world, who operate small boats on the canals and swamps and rivers of England, and who have their own customs, history, and structure of authority. Ma Costa and her family are important to Lyra. John Fa and Farder Coram also serve as her protectors and her guides. Other powerful adults in the narrative include Lord Asriel, whom Lyra knows as her uncle, and Mrs. Coulter, whom she meets for the first time near the beginning of the story. Mrs. Coulter is aptly named. She is in charge of the General Oblation Board, the gobblers, as they are called on the street, who are kidnapping the children of the poor in order to perform experiments on them. Oblation means sacrifice. It is the term used for the offering of the Eucharist in the Christian Mass. The name coulter refers to the nature of these experiments. A coulter is the metal blade of a plow. The word comes from the Latin for knife. Mrs. Coulter, then, is essentially Mrs. Cutter. In this way, Pullman identifies the experimental procedure known as intercision, which means cutting a child away from his or her demon, as a form of castration. The effect is to prevent children from reaching sexual maturity. The Church thinks that in this way it can reverse the effects of original sin, though in fact the children subjected to this procedure waste away in a slow and awful death. Here again, you notice the reappearance of a theme familiar from Dickens and Native Son, the theme of child sacrifice. The ultimate object of Lyra's quest in the Golden Compass is to put an end to the system of child sacrifice in the world she inhabits. In pursuing this quest, Lyra is aided not only by the Gyptians, but also by Yorick Bernison, who belongs to the race of Panzerbjörne, or armored bears, by Serafina Pekkala and her clan of Arctic witches, and by Lee Scoresby, an aeronaut or balloonist from the nation of Texas. It is worth noting that almost all of these characters act as surrogate parents to the orphaned Lyra. From the Master and Fellows of Cambridge to Ma Costa and the Gyptians, to Yorick Bernison, Lee Scoresby, and Serafina Pekkala, Lyra has a gift for attracting adult caretakers. She recruits them into her narrative, though. They don't take over the story, they support her quest. Next time, we'll start mapping the action of the first part of the Golden Compass, and we'll see how that quest begins.